Greetings, my name's James Wallerstedt, and I just recently in San Diego, California, wrote an article that was titled "The Need to Reset Moral Foundations." And this article was about our U.S. military and foreign policy. And I submitted it to a local magazine circulated free on newsstands in San Diego called City Beat magazine. I'm not really very familiar with it, but I had seen it on newsstands around coffee shops in town. And I picked up a copy of it a couple weeks ago, and I was reading it while I was in a coffee shop one afternoon. And the editor had an editorial in this edition of the magazine that was calling the PNAC group, this is the Project for the New American Century group, Dick Cheney, Don Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith, I think it's pronounced, Richard Pearl, a bunch of dark characters in our American pantheon of high politicos who had pushed for going into Iraq, actually after the initial bombings in the 1990s, a second push to kill Saddam Hussein and ultimately to establish this large plan to be permanent occupation presence in the Mideast of American forces. This editorial was referring to that group, the PNAC group, as liars, psychopaths, and war criminals. All those three terms were used. And I thought, wow, this is progress, because for 10 plus years I've been waiting for these types of things to happen, where there's so much evidence that there was bold lying involved in establishing the premises, like Colin Powell's famous, infamous UN speech of weapons of mass destruction and so forth. And the many questions that have been raised about 9/11 and what really happened there. I think almost everyone that has looked at it seriously concludes there was a controlled demolition involved. Architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth has been on that case for more than 10 years. There's some great documentaries and books. But as with the Warren Commission in the case of the assassination of John Kennedy, there's a lot of really troubling inconsistencies in the official 9/11 report and so forth. But that's a very inflammatory issue because of the huge implications of any major mistruth or high-level government disinformation on that particular topic. So regardless of what you think about that, it's become clear in the last 10 years, and especially in the last 5 years, that there was a lot of lying, intentional misrepresentation of truth involved in bringing our troops in an increasing manner over the last 20 years into Iraq. And then trillions and trillions of dollars have really been flushed down the toilet from our treasury, our national treasury. But if we try to measure the human energy, the human talent, the genius of our scientists and engineers and so forth, it's all very reminiscent of Dwight Eisenhower's warnings to our nation in his well-known farewell speech in the early 1960s about the dangers to our democracy and to our way of life posed by the unchecked growth of power on the part of this, what he called the military-industrial complex. There's a lot of things I conclude that our American society is going to need to come to terms with in the coming years. Right now, as I record this, in July of 2014, there's a conflagration in the Ukraine, and it's being represented as by our media and high-level figures in our government, such as Hillary Clinton and Dianne Feinstein and President Obama and others, as a troublemaking by Vladimir Putin and Russia and Ukrainian separatists, etc. And I conclude that, to the contrary, there is yet another CIA plot, essentially to brew up trouble in that region. But the nexus of that, or the crux of the issue, is that Europe is moving away from America in a very profound way right now. It's very sad to see. 2014 in the first time since the post-World War II era, because of course immediately after World War II we had allies in Europe, World War II, and we had groups we were fighting against, especially Germany, also Italy, and in that region of the world. And there has been a strong bonding, and the NATO alliance is part of this and so forth, that occurred immediately after World War II. We were involved in the Reconstruction Plan. This is FDR's plan, and George Marshall's plan that was carried out by Harry Truman's administration and so forth, and things of that era. But in the last 5 to 10 years especially, but maybe the last 20, European society, not so much the high-level leaders, because we have a lot of corruption at high levels of government leadership, both in Europe and here in the United States and elsewhere, but the European people, their sentiment has increasingly been distancing from American policy, because the kind of ethic that was demonstrated in the Marshall Plan, the FDR period, the New Deal for America at home of the FDR era, the Marshall Plan abroad, Reconstruction efforts in Europe of that era, the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights spearheaded by Eleanor Roosevelt, and then the John Kennedy administration, all of which had a spirit of greatness, a spirit of generosity, of human brotherhood, compassion. The higher values were being evidenced in both in our domestic policy and our foreign policy in the case of these administrations I just mentioned. Then there was the assassination of John Kennedy, following very soon after Dwight Eisenhower's farewell speech to the nation, in which he gave this famous warning about the rise of the military-industrial complex. And this is the military-industrial complex, and what he was getting at is the establishment of a secret government, a Stasi, potentially a Nazi-type element, a secret government element within what is meant to be an open, accountable, democratic, representative government following high principles, constitutional principles, Bill of Rights principles, constitutional law. All of those principles and ideals and government philosophies and so forth are at odds. It's an oil and water situation with the concept of a secret government. And our experience in history has always been that groups sheltered from oversight, where they can just stamp things with classifications. No, this is for these eyes only. This is a national security issue. This is this level of classification. This is like super ultra top secret. Then this is for, et cetera, that these privileges are abused. They're abused because given darkness, given the cover of darkness, given shrouds of secrecy, what always occurs is various levels of rot, of behavior that would not stand up to open scrutiny. And this is why when our government was established, in the case of the United States, we had checks and balances. We had this concept of a fourth estate in the media. What's happened is that and it's being fairly well documented now by different groups who have a lot of material on the internet, from the late 1800s up until today, so starting more than 100 years ago, there's been a series of major corruptions in how our government operates, turning it in the direction of a private corporation headquartered in Washington, D.C., which is not formally one of the 50 states, and a deviation in a number of steps over the last 100 plus years from the founding principles. The 1913 Federal Reserve Act was a major departure from our principles, but there's things that happened even in the 1860s. There are things that happened in the period of 1917 with the War Powers Act, which is still formally considered in force by our courts, even though never announced as such. Big issues there. The The Social Security Act of the mid-1930s, which has been greatly abused in terms of how it's been interpreted and citizens treated as chattels. There's a lot of things here of great concern, but really these tensions were in existence in our country, even in the Federalist Papers, for example, which was the debate, a series of debates, running debates and discussions and arguments that were occurring between James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and several others. And even in this initial founding period, there was the really powerful international banking cartel element associated with the Rothschilds in England and elsewhere in Europe, and very high-level cliques in Europe that were associated with the royal governments and with high-level feudal society, the remnants of the Venetian black nobility and so forth, that were trying to prevent the American colonies from breaking away from that influence, their gold standard, their trading controls, their military controls, their taxation controls and powers and so forth. And there were others that had more the true spirit of liberty that we saw evidenced in Boston in the case of Sam Adams and Paul Revere and that group around St. Andrew's Lodge and etc. And in the circles in Philadelphia that were in correspondence via the committees of correspondence between the Boston groups and the Philadelphia groups, crystallized with the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776, and this idea that we really could not afford to be under the wing of these international bankers joined at the hip to the royal cliques, joined at the hip to the Vatican, and so forth, controlling really human spiritual life, financial life, military affairs, and so forth. However, these forces that wish to control humanity and have a small elite and a great peasantry, they didn't go away simply because we succeeded in having an American Revolution and established some independence for ourselves. They were still there, and they, by degrees, both in our country and based in Europe and elsewhere, they have attempted to corrupt our system of checks and balances, our degree of accountability in government, transparency in government, and so forth. So my motivation in creating this video today really is to talk about the fact that I just became aware that a local magazine that I mentioned, I believe I mentioned, but in any event, a local coffee shop magazine, just published an article that I wrote, sent to them as an editorial comment about the need to reestablish moral foundations in our country. And particularly, I was mentioning that since the assassination of JFK, I don't feel we've ever had a president that really was set in his heart and the depth of his being to use our power responsibly in the external world and be honest about it. Jimmy Carter would be the only one I would consider to be in that same category, and he wasn't taken seriously. Ronald Reagan came into office immediately after his administration and talked about standing tall in the saddle. But what that translated into, standing tall in the saddle, was that this very handsome man, Ronald Reagan, former governor of California, was stage managed by a dark group behind him. The presidency was not managed by Ronald Reagan. It was managed by the group behind him, which included George Bush Sr., former CIA director. I don't remember when his CIA term was, but he's career CIA since he got out of Yale. Henry Kissinger, Donald Reagan, not Reagan, but Reagan, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney. This is the Illuminati dark cabal axis, if you will. And they were moving him around and telling him what to think and what to say about Iran-Contra and all these other things. But what standing tall in the saddle, even though it came across well to Americans because this idea of being proud and being strong and being able to go in the world and do whatever we want, sort of impose our will, which is kind of a mixed concept there, but because I greatly prefer the idea that we go abroad and be of use, constructive use to the world, more like our foreign policy could be the golden rule in action. which would be good for our economy too. It would be good. We could greatly reduce our military expenditures because you don't like to attack your friends and people you respect. And so as you make more friends, and more people respect you and admire you, and you develop constructive bridges with them socially, economically, and so forth, everything's better. Everything's better in your own country and externally. But that standing tall in the saddle just translated into a huge escalating, exponential curve of debt for our country being directed toward the military-industrial sector. So you take the taxpayers' funds, you create a fire hose out of it, and you pump it to these groups that Dwight Eisenhower was warning us about. And he had proposed that the defense sector be entirely nonprofit and strictly regulated. And he said, that'll weed out the fake patriots from the real patriots if you have people operating on a shoestring to protect their country where there's legitimate defense need, as opposed to drumming up trouble, sort of like the old East Coast Mafia fire protection racket, to create problems, then to come up with a solution that actually benefits the oil companies and the energy firms and the armaments manufacturers, and then they got the reasons to create false flags because the amount of profit being made is just astronomical and so forth. This is a problem. So what my article that was published in this local magazine pointed out, and I'm very pleased that they published it because it was very hard-hitting, and we don't get hard-hitting truth in the mainstream media. The mainstream media has been too bought in by this corporate cartel that we have in the United States internationally. It's very problematic, but it's coming under increased scrutiny that crosses through the highest level banking sector, the big pharmaceutical sector, big energy, Monsanto and the GMO group, etc. But I was just wanting to say that, these people that the editorial in a prior issue had called war criminals, psychopaths, etc., Cheney, Rumsfeld, the PNAC neocon crowd, who talked us into this huge debacle in Iraq, which now everyone's saying, it's a meltdown. There's ISIS, there's this Syria, Iraq axis, and it's been documented that more than 1 million Iraqi civilians have been killed in the period of the last 20 years through this process, and several millions displaced. Anyone who comes into our nation and tries to occupy it, and they're going to make deals and lock down the oil resources or the land, and they're going to impose a new government and so forth, we'd have every able-bodied American out with a .22, if nothing else, So it's hypocritical to think that any group can go into a nation. It's one thing to take out a dictator who's resented by his people and then leave graciously and then establish an arm's length foreign policy basis of social reciprocation, economic business reciprocation that's good for all and that's consensual. That's different than an imposed occupation that goes sideways, turns into huge no-bid contracts, trillions of dollars, missing hundreds of millions, hundreds of billions, trillions spent, hundreds of billions missing. This is not good for anyone. And now we have appeals of the wounded warriors who come back and they got post-traumatic stress. But, every single American who's joined the military during the period of my adult life, and I'm in my 50s, I was of the age where if I had just been a couple of years older, I would have been required to register for the Vietnam draft. I'm in my mid-50s. And we saw the debacle of that whole episode. Those of us who studied it found out that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was a false flag incident, that the CIA was running heroin out of the Golden Triangle. There's activity like this in Afghanistan. If you want to look into it, there's a big story there. There was a journalist recently killed who was onto that story. I don't recall his name right now, but do some Googling and you'll find the story. So people in our society in the United States today, 2014, and all the cheerleading that's gone on, support the troops, all the lack of attention to the kind of issues that were being brought forward by Dwight Eisenhower, by the Church Commission and so forth that could have taken us in a different direction. Support the troops, but, And the reason that this is said to be so important is because of the lessons of Vietnam, that these Vietnam vets came back and they felt unappreciated in this. And I lived through that period, and so I understand that, what was going on, but I think we took the wrong lesson from Vietnam, because the real lesson is don't permit your military forces to be committed under a false flag agenda. And don't allow your high government officials to wait 30 years before they confess. Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense in the Kennedy administration, who was involved in pulling us all into this, the domino theory and a lot of nonsense, 30 plus years later, I guess it was 40 years later approximately, does these televised confessions where he says, yeah, the Gulf of Tonkin incident was basically fabricated. And others have come out who've been involved in the Air America flights with CIA, with the heroin coming out of there, and talking about how the French were withdrawing, so we felt we needed to get involved, and then they manufactured incidents and circumstances to cause this to happen. So the real lesson for us to have taken away from Vietnam is not support the troops unconditionally, Americans who serve in the military, defense contractors, etc. It is do not allow our nation to be involved in false flag, bogus agendas where we commit precious human resources and precious financial resources and go into greater debt with the Treasury. When our national debt really took off, it was in the Vietnam period. It took off and then it leveled out a bit, and then once again in the Reagan era, with the stand tall in the saddle thing, it took off again. In both cases, the escalation of the national debt is associated with huge amounts of money going to this military-industrial sector that Dwight Eisenhower warned about. So what I want to suggest here, I don't want to make this video too long, is something that I mentioned in this article that I recently had published, is that we need to take more responsibility as citizens to scrutinize our foreign policy and what's really involved and be judicious about it. And our military, the people who are on the payroll in the Department of Defense, in these intelligence agencies, in the State Department, have a triple duty, a 10 times responsibility to be on the ball as to what they are being asked to do with regard to U.S. foreign policy. Is it constitutional? Is it truthful? Is it ethical? Or is it actually criminal behavior, false flag events, etc., etc.? They have a duty to our society. They're getting paid for this sort of thing. I'm not. For going back 30 years, but let's go back 20 plus years, but in the 80s anyway, so roughly 30 years, I, as a self-employed individual in San Diego, would never accept contracts that were associated with the defense sector, simply because I felt my nation was spending too much money in that already. I didn't want to contribute. So I want to just suggest that our definition of what is patriotic and what is responsible as an American needs to change in the years to come. And there's going to be a lot of information coming forward about hidden agendas and so forth that will assist us as a society to reestablish a moral foundation for both our domestic and our international policy. So I'm going to conclude this video here.